Muy buenos días. A continuación daremos comienzo a la Conferencia Internacional de Desarrollo y Cohesión Social 2020, organizada por el Centro de Estudios de Conflicto y Cohesión Social, el COES, y el Núcleo Milenio en Desarrollo Social, DESOC. Dejo con ustedes al director alterno del Núcleo Milenio DESOC, profesor Esteban Puertas.
Gracias, Cynthia. Thank you everybody. I'm not quite sure if I have to talk in English or Spanish, but since there is a translation, and Sonia is here with us, I want to welcome everybody for coming, for being here in this starting of our workshop. We're very happy as the SOC Center working with the COES. This is our first international workshop that we are organizing. Hopefully not the last one, and we are happy that COES is joining us. They have a lot of experience, and we have a lot of collaboration with them. We wanted to make a year ago. We thought about this seminar, this workshop about social development, social cohesion, that type of things, and we started to look for people, and Sonia was a perfect fit for all of us. Of course, we wanted to do an in-person regular workshop, which we were not able to. Nobody was able to do any in-person workshop during this year, and I don't know about the next one. But we're happy that it works this way. It might be easier for some things to do it online. We have a whole range of possibilities now to make more, bring more people and people from all over the world coming here. Again, we're very happy that you are here with us, Sonia. I want to thank you for agreeing to giving the talk. For those who I'm going to introduce briefly Sonia, because
y quisiera presentar a Sonia brevemente, por si no la conocen.
Sonia at the Essex University. She has an amazing amount of work done on several topics, an amazing number of papers, including health, child development, gender economics, which is the topic that we're going to see today. And I think this paper is very, very interesting. The data that she's using with her co-authors, of course, is quite amazing. There's a lot of work there, I imagine. This is quite impressive. She's, again, an amazing researcher on all these topics. We're very happy to have you. So I'm going to leave you to start your presentation. Again, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Esteban, for this very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I feel connected with Chile for some years because of co-authors, including Damien Clark, who's now, I see in the participant list, who I've worked with for several years. And I've also noticed that Pilar and Francisco are in the group today. And we are together with Damien, working on a project on domestic violence in Chile, particularly domestic violence under quarantine, looking at the imposition and the lifting of quarantines. That work is still in progress, or I could have presented it today. So this work is on Brazil, and we're specifically interested in unemployment shocks. It's joint work with Diogo Brito and Paolo Pinotti, who are both at Bocconi, and with Breno Sampaio, who's at Pernambuco. So domestic violence is far more widespread than I would have imagined till I saw the statistics. About 1 in 3 women report having ever experienced violence of some sort. So as women are not a minority social group, it's one of the most widespread violations of human rights. It's also expensive, both in terms of medical care and productivity shortfalls. It's a fundamental cause of and manifestation of gender inequality. Despite all of this, it's drawn significantly less intellectual curiosity from economists than other aspects of gender inequality, such as the pay gap. One reason for this is probably that there isn't enough research establishing the economic associations, both cause and effect, with domestic violence, and part of it is that there is a long-standing problem of limited data on domestic violence. So in this paper, we ask, how do economic shocks and economic policies influence domestic violence? We use rich administrative data from Brazil. We ask 3 different questions in the same setting. How does male job displacement affect perpetration? How does female job displacement affect victimization? And for both of these, identification will involve studying individuals who are displaced in mass layoffs. This is a well-used identification strategy in labor economics, and the premise is that people laid off without cause in a mass layoff are typically laid off in a manner that's uncorrelated with their traits or with their time-varying behaviors. In other words, they're not laid off because they did something that is possibly correlated with the behaviors determining the outcome. In a departure from most other studies in the domestic violence domain, we feel we have some handle on addressing endogenous reporting. Endogenous reporting is the concern that the fact of being unemployed influences reporting, and I'll explain more later. The third parameter we estimate is the impact of unemployment insurance access or eligibility on moderating any impacts of job loss on violence. We're going to argue, and I hope I'll get to the end because that's where I really tie it in, that having the confluence of these 3 parameters in the same setting puts us in a particularly strong position to illuminate the underlying mechanisms. So regarding mechanisms, what is our hypothesis, our framework? Our framework is very simple, but it isn't one that's been used in the domestic violence literature. It's a simple labor economic setup. Job loss is a significant shock to income, identity, and time. So the income shock, we argue, triggers renegotiation over a smaller budget. So you're in an equilibrium, you're going along, and then one partner loses their entire income. That's big, that's 100% drop in one of the possible incomes in the household. Then the partnership needs to renegotiate the allocation of that fund, and this opens the door for conflict. Now, this may be aggravated by an identity shock involving stress, anger, or substance abuse. The labor economics literature has documented that job loss compared with, say, divorce or bereavement causes persistent unhappiness. In other words, if you look at lags and leads for events of divorce or bereavement, you see much faster reversion to the baseline for those other shocks than you do for unemployment. And you'll see that this persistence is quite important in our analysis today. Job loss has already been associated also with substance abuse, which is thought to be a marker of stress. In the domestic violence literature, both of these mechanisms have been linked to domestic violence. There's a paper by Card and Dahl emphasizing the importance of emotional triggers. In their case, it's their favorite team losing a football match, and there's a direct association between alcohol abuse and domestic violence has also been established in fairly causal work. Job loss also creates a time shock. The couple, as long as one partner spends much more time at home, on average, the couple will spend more time together. We call this exposure in line with a paper by Duggan et al. In the criminology literature. Exposure is similar to is the inverse of incapacitation in the crime literature. So if you're in prison, you can't commit another crime. And this has been discussed in the crime literature. What's important for us is that the prediction of each of these mechanisms, income, identity, and time, is that it will increase domestic violence, irrespective of which partner loses their job. We're going to argue towards the end of the talk that the relative magnitudes of the impacts of male and female job loss will depend on who loses their job. So if underlying this is a bargaining model, so if the man loses his job, his violent tendencies are likely to be muted because his outside options are worse. And similarly, if she loses her job, she may become more tolerant of violence. So our argument is that there is an underlying tendency for conflict driven by these three shocks, by there being less income to share, by there being more time spent at home, and by at least one person suffering a sense of failure. So it's important to understand, and I'll come back to other papers in the literature at the end, that we're arguing that it doesn't matter who loses their job, but there's all of these mechanisms point to an increase, but the size of the increase could depend on whether it's him or her that loses the job. So within the same framework, unemployment benefits mitigate the income shock. They constitute a positive shock to income, but they could reinforce the time shock. And this is because there's a considerable literature in labor economics demonstrating that access to unemployment insurance lengthens unemployment durations. It allows people to search for longer. And that means people have more time at home. So while the income effects of unemployment insurance will tend to mitigate any impacts of job loss on violence, the time effects could increase this, making the impacts of UI ambiguous. So our main results are consistent with this framework. We find an increase in domestic violence following either male or female job loss, and we find no mitigation from access to unemployment insurance. And we argue that our results are consistent with this framework, where income, identity, and exposure are mechanisms. So our contribution to the domestic violence literature, in a sense, is bringing labor economics to this literature. We provide the first evidence of impacts of individual job loss.
De pérdidas individuales.
There is already a large literature showing that individual job loss has large effects on other important life outcomes, including prime-aged men dying early, mental health, fertility, and divorce. It's also quite unusual in the domestic violence literature to have results for male and female job loss in the same setting. The closest relative to this paper is a recent paper by Haushofer and others, who study cash transfers to both men and women in an RCT in Kenya. We provide the first evidence whatsoever of impacts of unemployment insurance to mitigate these impacts. There are several studies in the domestic violence literature of cash transfers, but they're not cash transfers following job loss, they're simply cash transfers. But then they have different behavioral effects. In particular, a behavioral effect of unemployment insurance is that you lose it in most countries if you get a job. So you tend to take the available time and kind of try to time the job to happen after the benefits expire. That's what I mean by behavioral or incentive effects. So in larger terms, our contribution is a shift in emphasis. The domestic violence literature has focused on financial empowerment of women. So it conceptualizes violence as resulting from unequal power. And the idea is that if you give women cash transfers, microcredit, skills, or actual jobs, as in the studies I list here, then women will be able to combat the violent tendencies of their partners, but it rather ignores the motivations of men. So we introduce an additional focus on economic shocks to men. The literature is focused on relative income, so it's sort of built into the construct in the existing literature that domestic violence will move in opposite directions when a man versus a woman loses a job. And we argue that this effect is second order. It's subsequent to the big absolute income shock that job loss entails. And I will come back to the literature in more detail at the end. So now moving on to the usual structure, the data, the strategy, the results, and then a section on mechanisms. We have administrative data at the individual level for Brazil. It's longitudinal and we link across data sets. We identify domestic violence in criminal justice records. We have 2 million domestic violence cases observed during 2009 to 18, and this is 11% of all DV cases, it's 11% of all criminal justice cases. We define domestic violence as a prosecution or a protective measure. In the crime data, we can identify the defendant, which is always going to be a man. There are just very few defendants who are women, and we drop them. So we identify the male defendant and the female plaintiff by name. And then because this register doesn't have the Social Security ID, we build a database of all names in Chile in a manner I won't describe until Q&A. And then we identify, and that's to avoid duplicates, we identify these defendants and plaintiffs from the criminal register in the employment register so that we have their career trajectory. In this register, we retain full-time workers of prime age, 48% of whom are women. And just to emphasize the vastness of the data, it contains about 100 million workers, and they experience about 10 million layoffs each year. Although this is the main linkage between the criminal justice and the employment register, we also draw upon a household survey with a particular view to estimating the extent to which access to informal sector work buffers the impact of mass layoff in the formal sector. And then we further use the social welfare register, link it to the court records, so that we can identify couples. That's because the social welfare register has a sort of household survey attached to it. We remove non-unique names, but we do some robustness on this, which probably I won't discuss today. And I just want to flag that the name of the woman is missing much more often than the name of the man for confidentiality reasons. So although I will systematically present results for male and female unemployment, I'm going to show you results with a much smaller sample, 1/10, for female job loss, which will restrict the extent to which we can do mechanisms analysis for female job loss. So this picture is just a plot of the raw data. It shows you for male workers domestic violence, which means they're being charged with a prosecution or subject to a preventive measure across the age distribution. The black connected line is for workers who are continuously employed through our sample period, and the red line, which is distinctly elevated to about twice the vertical elevation, shows you that workers who are displaced sometime in our sample period are roughly twice as likely to commit domestic violence. So this gives you a descriptive preview of the association, but it's of course only descriptive. So our identification strategy is actually just a difference in difference. and we will estimate an event study so that we can identify dynamic impacts. Treat is an individual indicator, which is one if the worker was displaced in a mass layoff in year T. We look only at layoffs in the middle of our period. Our period is 2009 to 18. And this is so that we have the capacity to estimate dynamic treatment effects for 4 years after and placebo effects for up to 3 years before displacement. Mass layoffs have been used to identify dynamic impacts of job loss on other outcomes in the labor literature, for example, earnings and mortality. So you see that I is the individual time. We have actually month and quarter, but just to reduce noise, I'm going to show you annual estimates, but for some checks, we go down to quarter and month. So in this specification, which is a simple DID, the treatment is being displaced in mass layoff. So by definition, the controls in the pool are all those workers not displaced in year T. But we don't simply use all of them. For each, and this is important, for each treated worker, we create an individual matched control using basically everything available at the individual level, which is this list: gender, cohort, tenure, firm size, etc. We then check that treated and control workers are balanced, of course, on the variables used to match, but also on other variables, including, for example, education and occupation. Having this control worker match introduces into the sample never treated workers, which is useful. It also effectively controls for local shocks because the control worker matched to you is in the same state and the same firm, and so they should be subject to the same shocks. We nevertheless check whether we have fully absorbed local shocks by also controlling for a stricter measure of local shocks, because the municipality is far more disaggregate than the state, and these are 2-digit industries instead of these 1 digits. And this should really pick up local shocks, which you might imagine would affect, for example, surveillance of crime, provision of welfare, and things that are not just individual job loss. So after introducing all of these, in particular using matched controls and having these fairly fine controls for local shocks, what are our main challenges to identification? We think the main challenge is really just this one, that there could be dynamic selection into treatment. We look at pre-trends and they look like they are tightly around the 0 line, even if we use the quarterly data, which allows us to look more, to scrutinize them more precisely. But of course, looking at pre-trends doesn't, it's helpful, but it doesn't fully rule out selection. Let me just backtrack to tell you that we follow the labor literature by defining mass layoff as the event of at least 1/3 of the workforce of the firm being laid off at a time. But when the firm decides to lay off 1/3 of its workers, it still does decide which third. Why me and not the other 2/3? So there is a possibility that the firm knows something about your proclivity to violence. You're a certain type. Let's say you're not conscientious, and maybe being conscientious is correlated with proclivity to commit violence. So we do have to worry about this. So what we do is show robustness of our results to a stricter definition. We go from 33 to 50 to 75 and right up to 90% of workers being laid off. And in the extreme, we look at plant closures. Clearly for plant closures, there's no selection at the worker level. We then implement a similar strategy to plant closures, which is better powered, which is to compare firms. So you, of course, are working at the worker level, but you look at workers who were laid off. So it's all workers, whether, let me say this once more. So we compare firms who commit layoffs, mass layoffs, with firms that don't commit mass layoffs. And then we look at all the workers in those two groups of firms. So this is in the spirit of an ITT, like you would often have in a RCT, an intent to treat. And our results are very robust to all of this. I'm not going to show you until Q&A because there are lots of tables. There's also this recent literature, which I'm sure all of you who do applied work have come across. There are many different phrasings of the concern, but possibly the most relevant to our setting is that if you estimate a simple DID, you might end up with negative weights attached to some treated units. In this case, the unit is an individual man or woman. And then when you average to get the treatment effect, you may get biased results. This is particularly important in contexts like ours, but I would say most contexts, where you expect heterogeneous effects across the units or over time. So our use of the matched controls basically tackles this issue. We check by implementing the Chase-Martin estimator, and the results are more or less identical to our own estimator, which is basically introducing the matches. The third sort of concern is missing data. I already flagged that often the name of the plaintiff is missing. We address this by varying so let me just say, if you look at the distribution of missing values in the data, it's clearly clustered by jurisdiction. So, and the reason is that different jurisdictions have different rules regarding confidentiality. So we vary the restrictions we impose on inclusion of a jurisdiction. So for example, we only include a jurisdiction if it has at least 80% non-missing data. And then we vary this right from 10% to 90%, almost non-parametrically, to understand whether the missing data, which may not be missing at random, could be driving our results. And we feel they're not, because this experiment shows limited sensitivity. And finally, we address endogenous reporting, which I'll describe as I come to it. So our main results for male job loss. First, I'm showing you the first stage, which is how male job loss in a layoff influences employment. It's almost by definition. There's a drop in employment. The vertical bar, is the date of layoff, and you can see a drop of about 30% a year after. And you might wonder why this is not 100%, and this is because workers may, before the 12-month mark, have found another job. There's a lot of turnover, so workers are laid off often, but they also pick up jobs often. And there's some recovery, but even 4 years later, about a quarter of workers who were laid off are still laid off. The same pattern is reflected in months worked and monthly wages. Here I focus on labor income, which is just another first stage outcome, and the pattern is the same. I've got the numbers down here. Basically, on average, averaging over the 4 years post-layoff, workers experience a 41% drop in labor income. If you go into this exercise that I won't describe in detail, where we use a household survey, if you know Brazil, it's the PNAD, where we can observe mass layoff and we observe transitions to formal and informal sector jobs, and we observe earnings in both sectors. So we do an experiment in that survey, and we estimate that if we account for informal sector work, the drop in earnings is only moderated from 41 to 36%. So it doesn't make a big difference. So our main result is here in the second panel, where you see that prior to the event of layoff, the estimates are 0, but after layoff, there's a jump, which is significant, and it's interesting that it's persistent. And it amounts to a 32% increase in domestic violence. This is a table corresponding to that plot, and it shows you the numbers we've discussed, the 22% drop in employment and the 32% here. Why is it 48? No, it's here, 32%, sorry. The 32% increase in domestic violence. If you break this down into the two sorts of violence cases, which are prosecution and protective, you get 40 and 30%. Because of the persistence that we saw here, we have names, so we can identify if the man reappears as a name in the court register. If we restrict to first events, so that the sample only contains cases where the man appears for the first time, we still see an increase. And I will discuss in flagrante a bit later, but in flagrante crimes are crimes that are caught in action. It's the Latin, I think, for being caught in action. And this is an extremely useful category for us in the Brazil court records because it eliminates reporting. So I'm jumping ahead to the reporting issue. If you're caught in action, your victim hasn't reported you, and so the results are robust. In fact, for this category, they're larger. So this is the same picture as I showed you before, but using quarterly data so that you can examine the trends in more detail. And you see similarly no pre-trends. It's obviously more noisy, but there's a clear upward shift that's largely above the 0 line. Now, on endogenous reporting, it's actually a first order concern for male job loss, because if a man loses his job, he becomes less attractive to his partner for a long-term stable relationship, and so she becomes more likely to report. I'm sure one could tell other stories, so I should just say that that is an assumption, but it seems plausible from most economic models of behavior that the woman will be more likely to report. So since we see male job loss lead to an increase in domestic violence, it seems possible that this could be driven entirely by reporting. And this is what we need to eliminate. So I've already shown you results for in flagrante cases, and the results hold. So they cannot be entirely driven by reporting. It's also clear that the most serious kinds of violence, in particular femicide, are always reported. So if we generalize that, we would expect that low intensity domestic violence is more sensitive to reporting. So we're going to break down domestic violence into low and high intensity and see if low intensity violence is more sensitive, the chances reporting plays a role are larger. And then we can look at alternative measures, which include women's use of public shelters. And we don't actually yet have hospitalization, but we're setting up the data. So this is an event study for the in flagrante cases. You've already seen it in the table, and the relative effect is actually larger. Here we break down domestic violence by crime severity into according to the maximum penalty and the types. For example, threatening is less intense than battery and assault. And basically we see impacts across the board. I've just seen the time and I'm actually moving very slowly, so I'm going to try and speak faster. These are the results for public shelter use. I'm skipping details of data setup, but to do this, we linked the crime records to the Social Welfare Register of Brazil. So this is the 50% of the Brazilian population that receives some sort of welfare. And you see a 24% increase in the use of shelters following male job loss in a layoff. So the summary is that male job loss leads to a sharp and persistent increase in domestic violence. It appears not to be driven by selection. I haven't shown you the robustness checks, but they're in a paper and I can show you in Q&A. And they appear not to be driven by reporting. I'm going to talk more briefly about female job loss, but the structure of the analysis is the same. These plots look more or less identical to those for men. Women in Brazil don't work part-time, they work less than men, but they don't do a lot of part-time. So the first stage looks very similar. Again, the first stage is 40%, almost the same as for men. The increase in domestic violence in relative terms, that's relative to the mean, is actually larger than we saw for men. This is a table in the same format. We again look at first event, it's similar. And I should just clarify that here, of course, and let me just spell out, we're not looking at couples. So these results that are in front of you now, they are telling you how the chances that a woman files a prosecution or a protective measure against a man increase after she's lost a job. And so if she's filing the case, she's a victim. And it's all about whether she's more likely to be victimized after she's lost her job. And there are too many missing data to look at prosecution. So this is all about preventive measure. So a summary of these results. Female job loss increases the probability of filing a DV protective measure by 56%. These results I haven't shown, but trust me, they're very robust to both testing for selection and restriction and varying the included jurisdictions. It's notable that in the results I've shown you, comparing protective measure with protective measure, the results for female job loss are stronger. However, if we use the same sample, and I don't just mean protective measures, but also the same jurisdictions. Earlier we didn't. If we use exactly the same jurisdictions for men and women independently losing jobs, we don't know if they're partners, we just know whether they lose jobs. The coefficients are actually equal. However, we believe that female job loss, the coefficient on it, is an underestimate if women have a lower baseline share of household income. So remember that what we're looking at is whether or not you lose a job. That's binary. On average, women contribute a third of household income in Brazil. I hope that's right. I think that's right. But it's definitely less than a half, and I believe it's a third. So as long as women contribute less than a half of household income, when they lose their jobs, the binary event, the shock to household income will be smaller. And if a smaller shock generates the same coefficient, then rescaling women's job loss has a larger impact on household income. Also, we discussed reporting bias for men, but it's inverted for women. If a woman's lost her job, she becomes more likely to report. And sorry, I said the wrong thing. If a woman loses her job, she becomes less likely to report because her outside options are worse. And so if we see domestic violence go up, we're probably underestimating it if there's underreporting. So for both of these reasons, we think that our results are pointing towards larger coefficients attached to women's job loss, and that this is consistent with a bargaining model determining the relative magnitudes, as opposed to a different model such as backlash or control, which have been discussed in the literature and which I'll refer to at the very end. Now, as explained, to use the court data and maximize the range, the power of our estimates, we're agnostic on couples. We only know if the man perpetrates violence. We don't know against who. We know it's domestic, so it could be a child, it could be an ex-partner. And similarly, for female job loss, so far, we've only known that she's victimized after job loss, but it could be an ex-partner or, in principle, a brother. Now we use the social register, which is half of the full sample, and we are now looking only at couples. The main result is that we replicate the positive coefficients. We also look at some heterogeneity, and I summarize this here for speed. We find that the effects of male and female job loss are larger in families with young children. We also find the male job loss effect is larger when the partner, the woman, is not employed. And we can talk through this if you like in Q&A, but I'd have to talk through each one, but I've thought about it, and I believe that each of these results is consistent with the mechanisms of income, exposure, and with bargaining, explaining the relative effects for male and female loss. One reason we don't interpret these couples' heterogeneity too much is that, of course, a family with young children is also likely to have, say, a lower income, more time spent at home, and so on. So to do this properly, we'd have to condition on every other gradient. So these, and this is true for heterogeneity in many studies. If you cut by a characteristic like young children or education, you pick up the effects of everything correlated with that characteristic. So now I really want to get through mechanisms, because it's probably where our contribution is most unique. We did discuss that the mechanisms that seem obvious following job loss are time spent at home, loss of income, and possibly an identity shock. Here, we want to pursue the relevance of income. So far, we've just said all of that seems to push in this direction. But the reason we want to know specifically how relevant income is that we want to move on to consider whether income transfers could help. So we're interested in a possible policy option to contain impacts of violence after job loss. We do this in two ways. First, we investigate heterogeneity in the treatment effects by liquidity at the time of displacement. We use the fact that both severance pay and unemployment benefits in Brazil are increasing in tenure. So just to tell you how big this gradient is, if you're laid off with less than 6 months tenure, you get less than a month of wages and benefits. If you're laid off with 3 years tenure or more, then you get almost a year's wages at the time of displacement. So it's 1 month versus almost 12 months of liquidity. But of course, as I just discussed for the couples data set, we know that tenure is correlated with all these other characteristics. So in this study, because we're interested in isolating liquidity, we control for the gradients in these characteristics. In other words, we don't just control for income, we control for the impact of education in mitigating the effects of job loss or domestic violence, the gradient. Still, we cannot remove the concern that there are unobservables correlated with tenure, and so it might be those unobservables and not liquidity. We therefore also consider an experimental design where we leverage a discontinuity in eligibility for unemployment benefits to look at the impact of an income transfer. So first I show you heterogeneity in the impacts of job loss for men on domestic violence by the man's age, income at baseline, and education. And if you just look across, you see that this is the zero line here. So basically there are positive effects of job loss on domestic violence that are quite pervasive. There's one exception. After adding controls, the lowest income group. And the other thing you see, so first you see that domestic violence is actually not that sensitive to these traits. So the richest men here seem to commit almost more violence after job loss, and similarly for education. The other thing you see if you compare the solid lines with the dotted lines is that adding controls for the other gradients doesn't make much difference. So in the spirit of Altonji and Tabor, the fact that there isn't much movement in these coefficients does suggest that unobservables correlated with tenure are unlikely to be playing an important role. Sorry, I shouldn't have said correlated with tenure. I mean correlated with all these characteristics. Now we draw the same plot for tenure, and I put it on a separate graph because this is where we're drawing inference about the importance of liquidity. You see that the highest tenure workers, which are men with at least 3 years tenure at the time of displacement, don't commit domestic violence after job loss. And we see this as telling us that liquidity matters. The fact that you don't see differences by income must be seen together with this. So it's not income, it's liquidity at displacement. And the reason relates back to my very first point about mechanisms. You may be a rich family and you may have savings and capital, but if you say put your 3 children into private school, you've bought a big house and you've basically used your high income in various committed ways. You bought a house, you've got the kids in private school, then when you suffer, in this case, and you suffer displacement, it still means that you have to rejig your finances. You have to talk with your partner about whether to sell the house or take the kids out of private school. And this is why we think that the finding that rich people still commit domestic violence is plausible, alongside the finding that liquidity matters. In other words, tenure brings you liquidity, and so high tenure workers, which include some richer and poorer workers, commit less violence. Then the last, and then whenever I show you a result for domestic violence, I haven't done it here because of time, but we do it in the paper. We look back to see if this could be driven by the first stage, and it isn't. So differences in tenure do not create differences in the impact on unemployment after the layoff or how quickly you recover from the layoff. Therefore, it seems...
Sonia?
Yeah?
Sonia, you have 5 minutes, please. So...
Better be very quick. Can I take about 7?
Sure, sure.
Okay. So the last experiment. So unemployment insurance in Brazil is generous. It covers 80% of former earnings for 3 to 5 months. The eligibility criterion that we're going to exploit is that if you've been unemployed and claimed benefits before, you need to wait 16 months at least before claiming benefits again. This means that workers who've been unemployed for 15 months are just ineligible, and those who've left a 17-month gap are just eligible, and that's what we're using. It's clear that we now have a narrower sample of workers. So the first thing we do following standard RD procedure is to check that that the density of the running variable, which is weeks since the last dismissal related claim, that's continuous, there's no manipulation, and that there's balance on a range of covariates around that discontinuity. I mentioned at the very start that in labor economics, there's a stylized fact, which is that unemployment eligibility increases unemployment durations. And we confirm this on the Brazilian data. So workers who are eligible are on the right of this line, and they have higher unemployment durations. We think that's important to understanding our main result, which is that while you're receiving benefits, which is primarily in semester 1, there's no difference between the domestic violence tendencies of unemployed men who do and do not receive benefits. Once the benefits expire, you stop receiving cash, which is in the second year. It starts here. So it starts to unfold, and then it becomes significant, and then it grows larger. So once you've stopped receiving benefits, the men who were eligible are more likely to commit domestic violence. This result, which is apparently perverse, is robust to a range of tests that are in the paper, but I'm not showing you. This is the graphical evidence, and let me summarize what we think is going on. So eligibility has no impact while benefits are being paid, but then it acts perversely. Our pitch is that the income effects of benefits, which do kind of work, act to offset the time effects while benefits are being received. Because the income effects, as I discussed right at the start, are helpful, whereas the time effects increase exposure. But once the cash stops flowing, then there's just the time effect. The men who were eligible are at home for longer, and we showed that this is true after the benefits expiry date. And so the results are consistent with income and exposure as mechanisms. You might wonder whether workers who are receiving the cash save it so that it's available after the 3 to 5 months of benefit eligibility. But a recent paper for Brazil using the same employment data establishes that workers are present biased, as also in studies from Austria or America, and they don't smooth consumption. You could also ask here, why do you get this failure of unemployment benefits at the same time as you showed us that severance pay and unemployment benefits, when they're packaged together, and they discriminate between low and high tenure workers, they appear to work. So it's important to say we were using different samples. The benefits eligibility experiment is on a narrow sample of workers who are all low tenure because they're all around that 16-week threshold. That tenure gradient that we saw for high tenure workers who are not in the RD sample is driven by about 10% of Brazilian workers. So in Brazil, only 10% of formal sector workers are laid off with at least 3 years in their last job. Second, the fact that we coupled severance pay with benefits meant that we had much more variation in liquidity, so a bigger liquidity package. And third, severance pay has weaker effects on unemployment duration. So let me actually first say this, and I'll go back to mechanisms. Give me 2 minutes to say one more thing about the literature after this. So the main results are male and female job loss. Each on their own trigger large, persistent and pervasive, as in across education and income and age groups, increases in violence. We argue income loss and exposure are the leading mechanisms, but that bargaining plays a role in determining the larger impacts of female job loss. Importantly, this is possibly the most important thing, of course, to take away, unemployment benefits appear ineffective. But this is for a reason we understand. It's because of exposure. So our results from both the last experiments I showed you suggest that cash does work, but we need those cash benefits to be larger, and we need them to be paid while the men are out. So they could be, say, doing public works. If there aren't jobs, maybe unemployed men could be called in to do public works or charity. But basically, if they got out of the house, that would reduce exposure. It could also affect their happiness. It could mitigate the identity shock to be doing something like charitable work. One upshot of this work is that job training programs, which get people back into work, may be more cost effective than currently thought once the benefits in terms of lower domestic violence are taken into account. So, for example, there's a recent paper, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. If somebody's interested, please email me, which shows that it uses school data for the US, and it shows that a child who was exposed to the domestic violence of their parents not only has lower test scores, but there's a spillover effect to other children. And so as we accumulate more and more evidence on the economic impacts of domestic violence, it becomes easier to argue that the economic cost of, for example, sustaining a job training program is justified because there's an undiscovered benefit, which is of lower domestic violence. I'd also like to say these results are potentially relevant to COVID, as discussed in recent blogs I wrote for these outlets, because COVID is characterized by income loss and by exposure with lockdown. So it's quite important to be able to disentangle exposure and income loss, even though it seems clear that both matter, and therefore it's not so surprising that we've seen global increases in domestic violence during COVID. And I want to just leave you, I'll take like 1 minute, with the existing literature, which I never fully discussed. So there's a vast literature on domestic violence. In this slide, I'm isolating only those studies that are concerned with either women's earnings or women's unemployment. So these studies predict that male and female unemployment move DV in opposite directions. And we're contradicting these studies because we find they move DV in the same direction. The reason for this is that DV is modeled as the outcome of a power struggle. I won't read this, but basically this is a model I've been leaning on when I discussed reporting or when I discussed the relative magnitudes of female and male job loss. But the bargaining model has been used by these authors in the US and the UK to show that male unemployment leads to lower DV and female unemployment to higher DV. So you could ask, how come we contradict this? We find male unemployment leads to higher DV. And our answer to this is primarily that existing studies analyze marginal changes in the probability of becoming unemployed. All of these studies are using the area level unemployment rate, or either is using the area level relative wage. But if you think of the area level unemployment rate used here and here, it's clearly signifying a change in the risk that you become unemployed. So those people who stay employed while the risk of being unemployed is rising, they might behave like this. They might be muted. But the ones who actually become employed seem from our work to be more likely to fall into conflict. So we make an important distinction here between looking at area level unemployment rates, which involve some small fraction, let us say 10%, of people actually becoming unemployed, with the other 90% simply facing a marginal shift in the risk. And our contention is that those who become unemployed behave differently than those who incur this shift in a risk. And this is quite an important sort of contribution to the way of thinking. There are also statistical problems, which I list here, with the area level studies, including that they don't account for reporting bias. So we don't reject the existing models, but we nest the bargaining model within the framework where there's a big push in income, 100% loss in earnings for one partner that causes identity and income shocks and also the exposure shock. None of those mechanisms, identity and exposure, for example, or income, none of those mechanisms is triggered when you see the unemployment rate in your region moving around. You have to actually lose your job to spend time at home, to lose income, and to feel a sense of worthlessness. So we argue that the literature has been working at a sort of lower level, thinking only about a power struggle, but there's a big economic impact of job loss that leads to violence, and what happens after could depend on whether there's bargaining or there's an alternative model like male backlash or instrumental control. Okay, I'm conscious I've exceeded my time, but I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. This is it's been wonderful. It's a really interesting paper. The results are quite important, I would say, given actually the current situation with COVID. Just for everybody, you can write your questions in the Q&A section. We have one question there, but I will start with some comments and questions myself. Yeah. As I mentioned, this is a very interesting paper. As you said, this seems quite novel contribution to the literature. I'm not really that familiar with this, but how you are able to link administrative data here seems very, very interesting and quite amazing, actually. And the results are, for me, quite unexpected. Things like similar effects of men losing their job or women losing their job. And I have some questions that might be very, very related to the research and some more sort of what you're feeling about why are you getting some of the results. You mentioned this, but we were discussing this at the end, but when thinking about this type of models, I guess, if one of the members loses his or her job, I would think that their power diminishes, and I would think that should lead to lower violence, because I'm not quite sure, but if you have a lower outside option, you should be more willing to cooperate, I would say. I don't know. So in your case, violence seems to serve another purpose, or serve sort of I don't know, some pressure or something, not to be leaving the home or something. And that's why you might, I don't expect the opposite result that you mentioned there. That there are some evidence of that. So, but it's still not quite clear why it's not working that way. And related to that somehow, you mentioned that the effects could be for income losses or exposure. And I understand that. And what I'm not completely sure or I understand when you look at the years, and also the effects seems very big, very, very big to me. And I'm not quite familiar with the rest of the literature, but the effects seem very, very huge for what you show us. I don't know if that's common in the literature or not. And they very persistent too. You mentioned this. You have 4 years after layoff, 3 years after, 4 years, and the violence continues, or there is still a change in violence, which is, I don't know if that's some kind of habit or something that's going on there, and continues even though wages decrease, income decreases over the same period, but employment rises and month work. So that's also an issue. If exposure is one of the mechanisms, well, the partners, or one of the partners that was laid off is going to work again after 2 years, 3 years, but violence continues. Incomes decreases, but violence continues according to your graphs. Then I don't know if that helps more the income hypothesis or the exposure, or how to deal with exposure. And related to exposure is that what happens there? What happens in the family? What happens in the household when you have this family all together? It's overcrowding. It's you have to do more work around the house. I don't know if you are able to sort of imagine or have some evidence, something that why living together creates such a bad outcome at the end. So I guess that I have other questions, but those are the ones that I sort of been thinking about it a little bit more. And again, I think that this is really, really important. As you mentioned, the consequences, the economic consequences of this could be huge. So it's quite important to think of policies that prevent this. And you mentioned something about job training and the other benefits that might have, and I think that's also really, really important. So we will, if you can make some comments to my comments, and I will then go with some questions that we have at the Q&A.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting range of comments. I wrote them down, so let me answer briefly to each of your points. As regards the intuition that when when a partner is unemployed, there might be less domestic violence. That intuition is captured in these models. It's reversed depending on whether you're in this camp or this camp. The predictions are reversed, but certainly both of the existing, well, actually all the three existing models of domestic violence imply that one of the either male or female unemployment will be associated with lower violence. So we think that the reason we don't see that is that these studies are looking exclusively at violence arising from a power issue in the household, which is why lots of the randomized controlled trials that have been implemented, they're increasing now, are trying to empower women through cash or jobs or something. And the idea is this will balance the playing field. And our argument is that this does matter, whether it's whether she loses her job and her outside options deteriorate, or he loses his job. This issue of power does matter, but it only matters to determine the relative magnitudes. And our main point is that nobody has actually looked at job loss at the individual level. And if you look at the labor economics literature, it's shown that men losing their jobs in America can lead to them dying. There's premature mortality. That's quite big. It can lead to divorce, which is like an extreme case of domestic violence. So therefore, we're not surprised, because if it can lead to death and divorce, domestic violence seems to be like inframarginal to that. So it's mostly that it's not that we disagree on the same thing, but that the literature hasn't looked at individual job loss. And it seems plausible that that is such a big shock to a household that it can perturb the equilibrium. It can make a man feel, maybe a woman as well. I'm focusing more on male job loss, but it holds for both. Feel worthless, feel stressed, take on substance abuse, etc. So that would be the identity channel. It could also lead to a need to renegotiate, and you might have different views on how to negotiate cuts in your household budget. And you specifically asked what exactly is going on with exposure. I have to say, with the humility that economists must have when they hide behind big data sets, that of course I don't know what's going on behind exposure, but it does seem consistent. I actually myself think it's a little bit extreme that you spend more time with your partner and so there's more violence. I can only bow my head to the evidence that there are other studies showing that basically incapacitation matters. So for example, of course, going to prison almost by definition stops you committing crime on the streets. But there's also work in the education literature showing that if, say, schooling is extended and teenagers spend a longer time at school, then teenage pregnancy goes down. I guess it's a similar. It's similar in the sense that people might think, yeah, that's plausible, but isn't it a bit far-fetched? Do you have to be in school to avoid getting pregnant? I think it's the same thing. All these things are averages, and if there are more opportunities, it seems that on balance there is more crime. You could make up stories about people getting on each other's nerves, but I wouldn't do that, because you could also say that being together allows you to discuss your to negotiate your new budget in a more congenial way. So with exposure, I don't know, but this evidence is not isolated, and that makes it plausible. In terms of persistence, that's a good question. We've thought about it more. I'd say the simple answer is that the first stage is persistent, and the second stage is just a mirror of the first stage, a projection. So you do see some recovery in employment just after the first year, but it's small. Like in the first year, the average unemployment rate of people who were laid off is 30%, and at the 4-year mark, it's 25%. So I'd say the persistence is partly just mimicking that economic recovery is slow or persistent. But I also think it's very plausible that you fall into habits. So you may be someone who's never committed violence, which is why we isolated the first event. You lose your job, so you're not the type. It's not a history because of your childhood or something. So you've never committed violence, then you lose your job, you commit your first act of violence, and then you do it again because, I guess, of habits, or you discover you can do it. The other thing I should say is a data clarification. This is an average, and that persistence variable is going to pick up, by definition, also some delay in reporting. So the rate of domestic violence in year 3 includes women who are reporting 3 years later because maybe they've had enough. So it's a mixture of cross-sectional and within man behavior. but it's
I have there are some other questions here. One question is Elizabeth is asking whether the sort of mentioned this, but financial assets in the household. You have this figure where you show that by income quantile, I think, and whether assets could play a role here. Do you have information on assets, or I don't know if you do, whether that buffers somehow the income loss or something? If you could do that, or if you have some literature that relates to that. Another thing is, another question is whether the policy implications. You mentioned job training, which is sort of take people out of the house, but there might be some other things, and whether that recommendation policy is good for men and women at the same time or not. That's some two questions that we have.
Thank you. So with regard to assets, we've thought of this because assets would basically act like liquidity, especially if they were not in the home. So ideally you'd have some liquid assets. And if we could measure liquid assets, it would help us discriminate between this income effect we see for rich men and this disappearance of the impact with liquidity. So it's a really good question, but because we are matching court data to employment data, we know the income of the worker, but we don't know anything about their lives, like who they're married to or what their liquid assets are. In CAD-UNICO, which is this social welfare register, I believe we may, I have to check, we know a lot, we may have something, but those are 50% of the bottom of the distribution that receive transfers. So my guess is that they don't have a lot of liquidity, they're receiving transfers. But still, I could check because there might be some variation. On your, just remind me, it'll come back. What was the second question about?
The second is related more to policy, because you mentioned that there are some job training programs, and that sort of they just taking people out of the house, but maybe people should learn how to.
Yeah, well, they. So it's very useful to know about women, and we didn't show you this in the main results, but here is the heterogeneity by characteristics for women. Basically, liquidity does not have the effect it had for men. If at all, higher tenure women are more likely to be victimized. And it's not because of the first stage. So it seems that this liquidity argument doesn't work so clearly for women. It's a bit long. If we have time, maybe I'll say more. But let me just say we also did the unemployment insurance RD work with the female data. Because we narrow the sample a lot to being around the discontinuity, we basically find zero coefficients close to zero with very large standard errors. So we could say the effects of unemployment benefits for female job loss are zero, but the standard error is so large that we can't rule out positive or negative effects. So we basically, I think, are best to say we do not have information in these data on what happens when women get unemployment benefits. We think that the exposure should work similarly, so getting women out of the house should help. It should be symmetric because you need them both to be there. With the income effect, based on an existing literature, especially a recent paper set in Austria, it seems that, well, let me first say the income effect for women will be smaller because they contribute a lower baseline share. The identity effect for women seems to be smaller. Men seem to get more upset by job loss than women, and there is outside evidence of this. For example, in an Austrian paper that shows that unemployment duration leads men to have cardiac arrest and commit substance abuse. but not at all for women.
I see. Just one last question is about the layoff, the identification strategy you use. You mentioned that you use several cutoffs, but I don't remember quite this. How random you follow the labor literature? But do you have evidence of how random is this? Besides changing the cutoff?
Sorry, how random is what?
The layoff, the layoff, sort of.
So in terms of how random is the layoff, we can see, so we've done that, we can see that the control workers, there's a table in the paper, the control workers are matched to treated workers on characteristics, of course, that were used in the matching, but also on every characteristic we have that was not used in the matching. That suggests random. The fact that we don't see any pre-trends suggests random. The fact that when we control all these, whoever's really interested, I can send you a draft paper. We're just tidying up the writing, but it's written. When we control for municipality times, industry times, year fixed effects, the coefficients hardly move. It's very robust. And that also suggests, because the specific shock you're suffering might have wider effects, that well, it's a slightly different random. What it tells you is that your controls are very good controls, but the idea that you might be the chosen worker to have been laid off when your fellow workers were not laid off, our best test of that is that we go right up to plant closure and we do an ITT comparing all workers in firms with and without mass layoffs. And the coefficient magnitudes are very robust.
Okay, perfect. I think that we are right on time. Again, thank you very much for your presentation, for your time. It's been really interesting knowing about this. And I know that you are working with Chilean data, so we hope to see that paper soon too, with some people at our department. So again, thank you.
Thank you all for your time.
And I don't know, we have soon, in 15 minutes, we start with the sessions, and we hope to all of you see you there. And we have 3 more keynote speakers today at 6, really, tomorrow at 9, and tomorrow too in the evening. I don't know if somebody else is going to close this keynote address, or are we okay?